and the folks who have been working on this project. For the sake of time, I'm going to charge right into the presentation with a quick outline. I'm going to start today by briefly introducing you to the organizations that led this project, and then also provide some context of bird conservation science, and which is the foundation of the work that we're doing, and how bird conservation science applies more broadly to ecosystem conservation. I know that the work that we did on terrestrial land birds is going to come and join us and talk specifically about the mining project and the aspects of what we did with the North Pacific LCC funding. And then I'm going to close by discussing some of the ways we can apply the results, and then also think about some next steps within the context of the North Pacific LCC's new implementation plan, and hopefully that will generate some discussion. I'd like everybody that this is being recorded, so if you want to tell folks that didn't get a chance to come today, they'll be able to see this presentation. So PRBO Conservation Science was founded in 1965, originally as the Point Reyes Bird Observatory. And PRBO Science uses innovative science to support management decisions, focusing on whole ecosystems and birds as indicators. They increase capacity to develop nature-based solutions for wildlife and for people. A priority for PRBO Conservation Science is to help managers and decision makers can climate-smart decisions and reduce impacts of environmental change. Klamath Bird Observatory grew out of efforts to work in the Klamath-Siskiyou bioregion to develop a comprehensive bird monitoring program in collaboration with the Forest Service Pacific Southwest Research Station, and our work continues to focus in this area that is recognized globally as outstanding center of biodiversity in North California and Southern Oregon. Our efforts do extend to the western United States, and then considering migratory birds through the Americas. Sound science with an emphasis on bird monitoring and applied research. This forms the core of our programs. And our goal is to disseminate our science through targeted communications to those populations and people with those potential to advance conservation, such as natural resource managers. The bird conservancy is meant to conserve native birds, and that's throughout the Americas. The Conservancy envisions an America-wide landscape where diverse interests collaborate to ensure native bird species and their habitats are protected, and where protection is valued by society, and birds are routinely considered in all land use policy decisions. We are together under an organization called the Avian Knowledge Alliance, which is an international group of organizations, NGOs, and full-state and academic partners are dedicated to amassing, caretaking, and communicating knowledge gained from the study of birds. The advantage of the unique capacities of NGOs to ensure that the information we gather from studying birds is connected into all length of the conservation delivery stream. And at the core of what we do is a sophisticated data management system called the Avian Knowledge Alliance. We operate under the fundamental concept of birds as indicators, and recently the United States has started to release State of the Birds reports. And the State of the Birds reports recognize birds as indicators not only of our environmental and ecosystem well-being, but also of our economic and social well-being. And like the canary in the coal mine, try to consider birds for the sake of bird conservation, but then also help birds tell us the story of broader ecosystem conservation and help us make better decisions with regards to how we conserve and manage our ecosystems. As mentioned, at our core is the Avian Knowledge Network. A sophisticated set of distributed data centers that all strive to best practices for informatics. We bring together distributors, data users, and node partners to develop a series of either taxonomic or geographic or topic-specific nodes that not only bring the data in and protect those data, but most importantly, provide decision support systems that bring those data to bear in a relevant way. We are under the concept that birds as indicators and the delivery of science can be used as a catalyst for better ecosystem management. And here show a new biotechnical publication published by the Fish and Wildlife Service that provides examples of how the multi-species approach that we've used for land bird conservation not only can be used to conserve the birds themselves, but use birds as indicators in order to assess bird conservation needs, in order to set measurable objectives for management planning and therefore design management, and if adaptive management right and use the immense data that we've collected over the last 20 years of considering land bird conservation, monitoring no longer becomes an afterthought, but instead the information from monitoring is used to design our management and become the tool that we can evaluate the performance of our management with regards to the objectives that have been set. Considering birds as indicators, recently in 2010, the State of the Bird Report focused on climate change and considered birds indicators and not only recognized that climate's profound effects on birds themselves, but that we can use conservation science to inform how we work to manage in the context of climate change. And that's the basis of the project that we're working on. And so our proposal set out to conservation priority maps that inform climate adaptation strategy, to consider the important environmental factors so we can consider how are birds changing in climate, and then how are those environmental factors, how can we manage to improve our management within the context of climate change. Understand where we aren't sampling well with our bird monitoring, and then provide detailed models about bird distribution and abundance currently and 7 years in the future. And all of the results from this study are made available publicly to anyone who's interested in looking. And focused on southern parts of the North Pacific LCC. And with that, I'd like to pass it on to Sam.
Okay, I'll close to Sam. Can't I do that? Release the control back to me.
Uh-oh. Got it.
How to pass this control to Sam. There, I got it. Okay, see that you have the controls now.
Yep, here we go. Okay. Now, let me get this going. Okay, and we are here. So now I'm going to go into and just go through the project that was funded by the NPLCC, and that was really everything that John just talked about. Without the partnerships that our organizations have been working on for years and years, we never could have done this project. For the project, the first approach was we really wanted to identify, obtain, and federate and curate all existing avian observations that we could from the NPLCC region that we are aware of through our partners and through other organizations. So we really were reaching out to bring in as much data as possible. Then, the models that we're building are going to be we're used to create maps, and so we needed to bring in all sorts of information on current and future climate as well as soils and vegetation. The plan was to create models of the current and future distribution and abundance of 26 land bird species. And I point out the abundance part of it because there's been a lot of efforts out there at large spatial scales looking at probability of occurrence or presence absence. We've done a lot of work on that. This is one of the first projects that I'm aware of that really attempts to model the abundance at such large spatial scales with climate change. As I mentioned, we really wanted to take that information and be able to create maps that illustrate areas of conservation priorities, which take into account the current distributions of birds, but also their future distributions. Finally, we wanted to create a tool where all this information will be available so that managers could actually use it to support the decisions that they're making. And we see this site as a living website, so as people use it, we'd love to hear about it so we can advertise that, demonstrate how people are using it, and we hope it'll grow as science continues to advance. So one of the most important parts of this project and that I'm excited about, all the work that especially John and Bob Alexander put in for bringing in data for this project. They a hold of 17 different data contributors, which included conservation NGOs, state agencies, and universities. Part of the project, this is sort of data PRBO had collected and data that Klamath Bird Observatory had collected. Notice there's a real lack of data in Oregon and Washington covering the geographic extent. And through efforts, we were able to bring in 23 data sets, including over 900,000 new records illustrated by the dark blue points in the map there. And you see how those records really increased the geographic scope, the coverage, which allows us to produce much better models into the future. And of course, that these are all standardized studies. The people going out doing the sampling were doing repeat observations, which really allowed us to do sophisticated modeling than is typically possible if you're just using, for example, atlas data or other museum specimens or other types of data people are typically using to do these kind of models. We needed to bring in that GIS data, as I mentioned, and we proposed to use 5 different future models. These all were based on a combination of general circulation models and then regional climate models that really do a better job of simulating the local climate of the Pacific Northwest. So we had 3 different regional climate models, 3 different general circulation models. Modeled the period from 2049 to 2069, so you can kind of think of this as a 2070 projection. And all of the models used the A2 emission area, so the emission scenario. These models were the climate models we picked were sort of selected to be a range of the future conditions. And here I'm just a graph of the change in winter temperature predicted by models, and you see that they're predicting warming, but there's different magnitudes of warming, so sort of getting from above 2 degrees Celsius down to about 0.5 degrees Celsius in that time period. To create good models for the future, we really needed the first step was to be able to model the changes in their habitat, the changes in vegetation, and we spent a lot of time thinking what was the appropriate base layer to use. One of the questions we had to ask, well, it would be great to be able to model every species, but, can we realistically do that and project them into the future? What types of vegetation can we really do that with? The other point was, the goal was really to model bird distribution, so there's really no point in modeling vegetation types for which we don't have any avian observations associated. So we really go through and select from there. And then really wanted to make sure that the vegetation types we're modeling were useful for managers. What are the types that they use and think about in their daily work? And what we came up with was sort of a hybrid classification based on gap vegetation maps for the area. And by hybrid, I mean we took a look at the finest gap classes that are available, and then we looked to see if we have avian observations for each of those types. And where we did, we kept that fine scale. We didn't have enough avian records. Then we went to the coarser level of the gap classes and coarsened until we got avian observations with which we could build a reliable model. And so sort of this hybrid gap map to use in our modeling. So to give you an example, so the vegetation models themselves are built on both climate and other environmental variables such as soil characteristics, slope, etc. They are built use climate models which sort of we think are more important for limiting the distribution of plants. So things include annual climate variables. This is different than what we did for the birds, because we're focused in on breeding distribution. So we only included climate variables from that breeding time period. So there is different information going into the vegetation models than the models. Here, just illustrating an example of one of the types. So the North Pacific oak woodland. The map on the left shows a scaled probability of occurrence for that vegetation type. So these gray areas, yellow to green, are where we predict that this type to occur. Notice in the future that under this CRCM, CCSM model, the type decline probability of occurrence in the area. Some movement north, but by and large we see a decline. To give you a sense, when you use these large-scale maps as inputs into the models, you do tend to get really high predictive accuracy. For this example, AUC of 0.98 would be perfect discrimination. So we have really predictive accuracy with the model, but of course there is a big leap of faith to assume that as we predict into the future, we're going to miss accuracy. But at least we're doing a good job of seeing current environmental relationships. Okay, so modeled the bird distributions. Like we're having this standardized data allows us to do some more sophisticated modeling. We can correct our observed densities for the probability of detection, and in doing so, we look both the probability of occurrence of each of the species, and then where those species are predicted to occur, we can then model the density of each of those species. And here I'm just showing across the 26 species we modeled, we had really high AUC scores, 0.981, and then our correlation between our corrected and model density on average was about 0.72. So pretty statistics. Another way we looked at evaluating the models is, well, did we actually sample the environmental space with which we're predicting? So here is just an example of the environmental distance measured in Euclidean distance. So it's creating all the different climate variables into one index. And where you see areas in red, those areas where we didn't sample very well. So there's a big difference in the environmental space in those red areas and what occurs in our avian observation data set. But based on current climate, we're doing a pretty good job of sampling from region, and where I make the point that you can then use a map like this to go out and target new places to sample. These are the places that we're not doing a good job of right now. So then each of the 26 species, we did model the current and future probability of occurrence, presence, absence, and abundance, and density. And here's an example from the white-breasted nuthatch, looking at the density predictions for current on the left and 2070, the mean across the 5 different climate models in nature. We can take that information and really, one of the important ways to use these types of models is look at what are the percent changes that we are seeing under the different future climate scenarios. So in this map, what I'm showing is each of the 26 species on the y-axis, and then the percent change in total numbers of birds that we're seeing across the entire NPLCC area. And so then for each species, if you look across in the row, Each of the models is represented by one of the dots, and the black line indicates the 0% change. So if you're to the left of this line, that means we're projecting a decline, and if you're to the right of the black line, that means we're projecting an increase for the species. The things that quick out of a graph like this are some species that are more sensitive to climate change, and by sensitive I mean there's greater variation among the different climate models, as I showed earlier. Those climate models, there is differences. Some predict a warmer, drier future. Some predict a warmer, in some cases even wet future. So, so many of the oak species and the riparian species really show this variability among the different climate models. As for the conifer forest species, we do see some variation, but a lot less among the models. And then for the grassland species, in sort of models, we see this projections to the left of the black line, so species that are projected to decline in the future. Use our information to sort of integrate all of the vegetation models that we did. I didn't mention we ended up modeling about 80 different vegetation types. So we can look at the change in the probability of occurrence of each of those types and calculate a Bray-Curtis distance between current and future for each pixel. Do the same thing for the 26 species of birds. So the map on the left shows the vegetation or the different composition of the community that we predict in the future. And so areas are where we really predict turnover. The same thing on the right, except now focused on the bird species, and clearly there are big differences here. Remember, we're using different climate variables for each of the models. But we wanted to dive in, and for example, in the Willamette Valley here, we're predicting pretty high community turnover for the birds and sort of a moderate level of turnover vegetation. So what kind of information can we get? Well, for example, currently the models, and lots of this area is actually agriculture now. So it's a little bit of to make some guesses on what the appropriate habitat type be in these areas now, but it's predicting sort of this North Pacific lowland mixed hard conifer forest and woodland, and a North Pacific maritime dry mesic Douglas fir western hemlock forest. Those are sort of some of the higher predictability of occurrences for this area. But then transitioning to sort of more a Mediterranean California dry mesic mixed conifer forest and woodland, or a Willamette Valley wet prairie. On the bird side, we've seen some interesting patterns, and I just selected some of them, but one of the clear patterns that was popping out was for 3 of the 6 oak species that we modeled were projecting decline for species associated with that habitat type, and the other 3, sort of no change. So for the oak species, we're looking at sort of a no change or declining future. For the riparian species, 5 of the 6 species were projected to increase. And so we can start looking about how you can use this information for the future. If you're thinking about oak woodland restoration, for example, this area might not be the best place if you're trying to target these oak woodland related species. Whereas riparian areas, it might be an opportunity. Is there an opportunity to work with private landowners to get them to restore riparian habitat on their lands? Are there lands that we could, purchase for conservation that would really, with opportunities for riparian restoration? So I think that some models can really get us to start thinking about decisions that are going to matter for the future. Well, so we didn't just want to have the maps of the bird distribution and abundance, but we wanted to use them to create maps of conservation priorities. So the Zonation Conservation Planning software, it's a hierarchical landscape model that ranks the entire landscape of the birds. And so the idea here is you're really trying to prioritize core areas for all of the species. It's not based on species richness. It's really looking at the entire distribution, and in this case, the density of each of the species, and it's trying to protect those really high density areas. The same, we're also using both current and future models to prioritization. So we bring in the current and future for all of the 26 species for all 5 climate models. But in the future, we really have this problem of the uncertainty in the future projections. So what we do, we discount areas that have really high variability among the different species. And what that does is it says, Okay, an area that's predicted to be really good for a species, but low ability, low uncertainty based on our climate, that's going to be an important area. Whereas we might want to discount an area that's only good in maybe 1 out of the 5 scenarios. So we include uncertainty in our estimates, and then we can come up with these landscape prioritization maps. And so all it's doing is the darker areas in the map here, and pixels that you would last want to lose on the landscape, and the lighter areas are the ones that have less biological benefits. And so we did this, we did a version that you can see on the website that includes all 26 species, and then we also broke up the species into different habitat types, so conifer species, grassland bird species, oak woodland bird species, riparian species, and created conservation priority maps for each of those different habitat types. Okay, transition over and website here, and I want to do a demonstration of the tool that we created the site, and hopefully you saw the URL there. And does it look big enough for everybody to know I had to adjust the screen size?
Yeah, we see it.
Okay, good. All right, this is the home page when you get here. The main tabs that you're looking at are the home page, the map page, which is what most people will be interested in, but also pointing out that we are making all of the GIS data from the project available in the download models results page, and then a little bit about us, our project team, and our partners here. But I'm going to really focus in on the maps page. That's really where action is. And so we have different areas you can go into here, the bird distribution maps, those common priority maps I talked about, and then the environmental distance maps. So those maps you can use to look at where the sampling didn't really cover all of the environmental space. So I'm going to first look to the bird distribution maps. Here you got some choices. It defaults to zoom to the North Pacific LCC region, which we modeled. Choices where first you can select the habitat type of interest you're looking at. Here I've got conifer forest. Then for the conifer forest species, you can go through and select the species that you're interested in. And then you have the time period. So historic, this is the current climate period we're looking at, 1971 to 2000, or the future models that you're interested in. It defaults to show the density projections, but I just wanted to illustrate that we do have the probability of occurrence also. And this is, people are pretty used to this type of model, that the dark blue in the areas for the species that are predicted to be high probability of occurrence. Also created binary presence-absence maps. But I think it's, one of the values of the density here is you can really see, sort of the typical range map you might see, but when we start thinking about density, you really get a richer view of where are the really high density areas, where are the low density areas. As you mouse, ping around, you can see some values right there under those drop-down menus changing. It's illustrating the coordinates and the density from this map that I have selected. So that's one way to start getting information. Play with the opacity, so make the map more or less translucent using these control buttons. And then you can turn off background satellite imagery using this dialog here if you want. I'm just not going to let it do that because I'm having the DEM going in the background. You get around, as typical in a Google Maps style interface, but the other thing you can do is use shift-click, and that'll allow you to zoom into an area. So that's all I'm doing right here. So we just zoom in. I do want to point out that for the models here, so this is the species we selected, hermit warbler, and then here are the top, these are all the variables that had the most importance in the density model. So and they're listed in order of importance. So in this case, we have 2 habitat types that were really important, followed by a couple climate variables, and then other habitat types that were of less importance. The one thing you don't see from this is whether the habitat type had a positive or what is the shape of the relationship. But at least you do get a sense for what are the important variables that were in the model. A couple things that you can do, I'll point out. So when you do shift-click and get to a smaller area, you can download the data. So I just hit that download data button, and you get a zip file that will have that map in it that you have selected. Let's go back to the map, and it'll be right back to where we were. And the other really thing I wanted to point out is that we've generated this new project. You can draw a polygon around an area of interest, so I'm just going to select an area here in the Klamath National Forest. What this is going to do is create a report. Now, it's going to take a little while to generate, but I've already created one earlier this morning just out of and so what you do when you select that area is you get a report like this. It'll show you the area of that polygon you drew. It'll start giving you summaries from the data. So here's a summary of the change in the mean temperature during the breeding season for that polygon you selected for each of the 5 climate models. So we see we sort of have a range of just above 0 to moving to 2 degrees Celsius. And the range of the gray here is sort of the spatial variability. Same thing for precipitation. So we have some models that are drier, and then one model that is really stretching into wetter. The difference between the minimum temperature and maximum temperature within the breeding season. So some of the models showing less of a range in temperature, one of the models showing an increase in that range. And then we have projected total abundance for that selected area. So for each of the species, and these are sorted by the high abundance to low abundance species. And the way to look at this, in each of these, the blue triangle represents the current projections. So you can get a sense for, okay, some of the models project a decline to the left of the blue triangle, and we're projecting increases if those other icons are to the right of the blue triangle. And so you can go on and start analyzing that for each of the species. I will point out that we're showing total abundance here, but these are at sort of 900 by 900 meter pixels. And so it's probably better rather than to take these numbers as a real estimate of what the future abundance will be, but rather an index of abundance. So you can sort of gauge the relative importance of different areas in your region or across the different future climate models. We had the hermit warbler selected, so then you get some information specifically about that species for current and then each of the future models, so total abundance and then mean, min, and max of density. And the species-specific total abundance for each of the climate models graphed here, as well as the densities graphed out. And then just a map of the area. So again, here's the larger area that we were zoomed into, and then here's where I drew my polygon. You can generate these PDF reports, and the idea being we're hopefully that you come to this site and right away get some useful information that can help with the management decisions that they're working on. So with that, I think I'm ready to pass it back over to John to wrap it up. And what do I need to do here to?
I think you did it, Sam.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Appreciate the segment. Again, we'll do questions and answers here in a minute, and your questions for Sam. I'm just going to wrap up with some these tools. So I'll turn this back over to you, John. You have the controls now, and then after you're done, we'll do the question and answer.
Very much. So here's, again, those tools are available both through the node of the Avian Knowledge Network, Avian Knowledge Northwest, which is a node that resulted from this project, and also you can go directly to the tools with these two addresses. I will, at the end of the last slide, we'll have these web addresses on them as well. So, as bird conservationists, we think about birds, but we also understand that in order to do conservation, and more importantly, to use the science that we've collected on birds to do better management and ecosystem conservation, that we also need to think about people. And through Partners in Flight, which is a land bird conservation initiative in Oregon, Washington, and California, we've focused some of our attention on social science, and specifically thinking about the land managers and the people, as I mentioned before, who have an opportunity to use the information that we're gathering to better inform their efforts for conservation. And part of the way we do that is through the concept of decision support tools. I'm not seeing. Here we go. Great. And so decision support tools are science-based, and they usually, ideally include peer-reviewed science. But we also, while we're going through the peer-reviewed process, like in the situation for this North Pacific LCC, we try to create decision support tools that deliver that science in real time. And the decision support system that is an example of that. And we're always thinking about who's our audience and what's the question, and what are the information gaps and how can we transfer those information gaps, and where are the transfer points in order to engage the conservation actors with the science. And that takes a social science approach using mixed methods to understand that. And we have some research about decision support tools that kind of builds on our ability to target transfer mechanisms for the science. One of the things that we've done in the Pacific Northwest and actually throughout the western states in California and Oregon is developed very oriented conservation plans. And these conservation plans become the link, in this example, between this climate modeling and the general habitat types. And what these conservation plans do is they actually think about the birds on the landscapes as indicators. We're actually advocating and have written a few letters from both Partners in Flight and the North American Bird Conservation Initiative to demonstrate how we've used suites of species to understand ecological conditions of importance, inform the guidance that's being set forth for the surrogate species program in the Fish and Wildlife Service, where we're advocating that a surrogate species, a given, we don't really want to choose one species, but we'd rather see our ability to choose the suite of species that represents the environmental conditions. And so this graph here from the new conservation plan for coniferous forests in Oregon and Washington, on the y-axis shows success stages. The x-axis shows conditions that are of importance that relate to functioning ecosystems within those. So if we think about coniferous forest birds and the distribution models that we've just presented, we can then go to this conservation plan and understand what are the specifics that we can manage for on a landscape currently and in the future that relate to the distribution of these birds, and then so how do these birds as surrogates for the ecological conditions that are important within a coniferous forest in this example. And so how are we using these conservation plans to bridge the information that we've gained from this North Pacific LCC project and apply it? And so I'm going to give a couple examples of work that we're actively working on or that partners are actively working on. The Klamath National Forest is going through a process where they are prioritizing watersheds for restoration, using information about fire, using information about vegetation conditions in those habitats, and considering that within the context of their priorities within their forest management plan. And what we're going to do is we're going to take these distribution models. This one shows the rufous hummingbird. This is an interesting bird for the Forest Service because the Forest Service has led a project called the Western Hummingbird Partnership, which is using these charismatic birds to consider, broader questions of ecosystem management. In this situation, the forest will rank their watersheds. An example that Sam mentioned, let's say several of their watersheds, they prioritize oak woodland restoration in those watersheds. We'll use the oak woodland bird maps, both current and future, to further rank those watersheds because there's only so much conservation dollars to make sure that the conservation dollars are being put in the watersheds that are most likely to have oaklands persisting into the future. We can do this with different coniferous forests. We can think about forests that they're trying to move more towards spotted habitat under the new designated spotted owl rulings, and think about the suite of bird species that indicate we're going to be most likely successful at moving those habitats towards the desired objectives that are outlined by the manager. And it's really important, our approach is often we use our tools to inform your alternatives as managers, as opposed to actually tell the managers what we think should happen for bird conservation. Instead, we like to provide a set of alternatives and then evaluate those alternatives because managers we recognize don't have different things that they need to think about in the decisions that we make. And so if we can bring science and we can bring what we learn, what the birds tell us about the ecosystem characteristics out there to bear on those decisions. project that is happening is Nature Conservancy and Oregon Department of Fish and Water are looking in that area of the Willamette Valley that Sam highlighted in his presentation of the tools, considering the future densities of 3 key species, using the maps that predict the future abundances of those species as targets, and then also considering them within the context of the current distribution maps to determine optimal areas for conservation and actually do rankings and help to inform the decision about where the conservation dollars will be spent. The birds report looked at the distribution of birds at a continental scale to identify the stewardship responsibilities on public lands throughout the United States. And now within the bird conservation community, we're trying to step those distributions down to understand more regionally the conservation stewardship opportunities, and then also as I can help use the bird conservation plans to identify management strategies within those areas. And so we're working with the National Park Service and the Bureau of Land Management, and specifically the Bureau of Land Management's National National Landscape Conservation System to evaluate federal conservation lands within the Siskiyou bioregion. This is specific to the region that we're working in here. And what this map shows is that in the Klamath Siskiyou bioregion, 16% in the upper left-hand corner of the federal lands, high level of conservation status. They're national parks, they're wilderness areas, they are national monuments in the Bureau of Land Management system. So you can look at a bird like a hermit warbler, and we're doing this for all the species, and how's the distribution of these birds on these conservation lands? Are the conservation lands accounting for our priority bird species? And in this situation, the hermit warblers are skewed a little bit more abundant. They're skewed on these conservation lands. So while there's 16% of the area of lands are conservation lands, 28% of the abundance of birds on those federal lands are in those conservation areas. So then we turn back around and we can think about the bird conservation plans and habitat objectives for hermit warblers and the other suite of old growth associated species like the hermit warbler is, and actually help managers in those protected lands and what the quantifiable habitat objectives are. And it's really about taking broad objectives and using what birds tell us with their relationships to set quantifiable, measurable objectives of landscapes. Some of the proposed applications of these tools really associated with natural resource management planning. We are talking to national forests as they gear up for forest plan revisions to use these models to not only consider the current distributions, but also consider projected future distributions, and then, again, take broad-scaled objectives and make them quantifiable, both on a population objectives, key indicator species, how many birds do we want on a given national forest in the future, and what are the quantifiable habitat objectives associated with those species that represent broad desired conditions. How many trees per hectare of certain sizes, how many snags, different plant composition values. So we are hoping to and discussing with folks from the Bureau of Land Management with regards to informing the Western Oregon plan revisions. Working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we are hopefully have a proposal into the Intermountain West joint venture to consider the comprehensive conservation planning in the Klamath refuge complex. And we would like to see how we might be able to use these models to integrate climate into the vision of the state wildlife action plans in our areas. A very exciting private lands set of projects that we're all working on to identify oak woodland conservation opportunities. And as Sam mentioned before, we can use the future projections of oak woodland habitats and oak woodland birds to help rank where we're going to spend NRCS and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service partners for private land dollars on conservation. In the context of the North Pacific LCC implementation plan, you can see through the Avian Knowledge Network we're improving cross-boundary data availability and integration and synthesis. And so one of the things we'd like to use is the Avian Knowledge Northwest as a decision support system, as a data archiving repository Observatory and as a data delivery tool to further our work, not only in bringing these data together and making the raw data available for people, but also expanding this effort to understand bird distributions currently and in the future. Hopefully working with the North Climate Science Center on a project like that. Other one is to identify existing tools that we have. The PRBO Conservation Science, in their data center called the California Avian Data Center, they have a bunch of really interesting management tools, specifically, for example, some tools associated with the Sierra Nevada framework that the National Forest is using. How can we bring those tools to bear in the Pacific Northwest by transferring them to the Avian Knowledge Northwest node? Really great opportunities to develop case studies that can enhance the practicality and utility of these existing tools. So like a great case study might be if we can apply these to beacon planning or national forest planning or the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife Services State Wildlife Action Plan. These would be great case studies to identify how a decision support system such as being developed by Avian Knowledge Network can really be used to influence conservation at large scale. And we have a little bit of time for questions, so I'll turn it back over to John and hopefully have a little bit of dialogue about what we've presented and where we might take that into the future and, importantly, its application for ecosystem conservation.
John and Sam both. It seems like we have a group of about 50 people. Probably the best way to do this is just to ask, give a name, who you're affiliated with, and then ask your question to either John or Sam. See how well that works. Nobody has sent me any questions yet through the chat function, so they must be in people's heads still. So we will have the record function if that makes people more willing to ask questions and have dialogue. Just for the record, we now stop the recording. And I would encourage people to ask questions. So whoever has the question, just jump right in.